This video is sponsored by Morning Brew. I prefer cold brew coffee to start into my morning, but just like everyone else, I also start into my morning by reading up on the news. And Morning Brew is the ideal newsletter for this. Instead of browsing through various different news sites, Morning Brew arrives in your inbox every morning with easily digestible updates of all the world's business, tech, and finance news and all the headlines, with links to relevant articles, which you can also get through in less than 5 minutes. And best of all, it's all free. I have been using Morning Brew for a few months and really like it. An article that recently caught my interest is how the once much promoted adoption of Bitcoin as a legal tender in El Salvador turned out to be a monumental flop and may still cause substantial damage to the country. Don't forget to sign up at morningbrewdaily.com/Kraut or use the link in the description below. Many thanks to Morning Brew for sponsoring this video. And now, let's get into it. Take a globe and follow the 38th parallel and you will come to a very unique place. The border that divides the Korean Peninsula into two separate spheres. This border is a legacy of the Cold War. After the end of the Second World War, the former Japanese colony was divided up into administrative zones between the Soviet Union and the United States. Both created regimes allied to them in a brewing conflict between the two global powers. In 1950, the North invaded the South, beginning a brutal 3-year war that after several back and forths, in the end didn't change the map much at all. The border remained at the 38th parallel, with the state in the South allied to the Americans and the state in the North allied to the Soviets. The only substantial change this conflict brought was the utter devastation of the Korean Peninsula. Up to 3 million people had been killed, many more displaced, entire cities had been destroyed, infrastructure was ruined. This put the two Koreas and their peoples into a very unique position, because both Koreas had to embark on a project of rebuilding their new respective countries. Both had to rebuild something basically from scrap. And the results are incredible in how different they are. It is rare to find a culture and people so rigidly separated into two different societies and economies of scale. And it is even rarer to have such a stark contrast between the two. One is a prosperous democracy, a champion of the global economy, a country known for excellence in engineering, scientific advancement and industry, a stable democratic society under rule of law where rights to property, life, speech and public sovereignty are enshrined and protected. South Koreans enjoy some of the highest standards of living in the world. They are among the best educated in the world and are increasingly known for their art and creative expression. The other Korea is a Stalinist hellscape. When it isn't smuggling heroin or counterfeit currency, it is threatening the world with nuclear war. It has trouble building the basic agriculture and trade infrastructure needed to feed its own population. Due to decades of repeated famines, North Koreans are on average 3 to 5 inches shorter than South Koreans. There's no rule of law, only the decrees of an absolute and all-powerful dictator. Offending the North Korean dictator in any way can result in an immediate death sentence. The vast majority of the population wallow in misery, poverty and despair, while the country's dictators live in wealth and luxury. Tens of thousands are imprisoned in gulags and forced into labor camps all across the country. The public has zero influence over the policies of the state. There's no public accountability. Rights and liberties are a fantasy. The population is indoctrinated by the state into believing that unicorns existed, that they are a superior race, and that their country is a paradise on earth and the wealthiest in the world. Yet, this state has to guard its borders to prevent its citizens from fleeing. The contrast could not be more extreme. One country is known for K-pop, cars, mobile phones, Oscar-winning movies, and amazing cuisine. The other is a nation of starving, angry, racist midgets with nuclear weapons and a fat king. The absurdity of North Korea is frequently in the news. There are many ways to see it, as a geopolitical threat or a weird place from another age, and many just see it as a joke. But I like to see North Korea differently, and I would encourage you to look at North Korea that way too. The division of the Korean Peninsula is the largest nature versus nurture experiment in human history, conducted over the course of a century on millions of people, and its results are very conclusive. During the 1870s, the Italian prison doctor Cesare Lambroso was hacking apart the corpses of dead inmates in the Pesaro prison. The Italian state was only 1 year old, formed out of a revolution that had kicked out the Austrians and unified a group of duchies and cities into one state. And that state already faced a problem: the South. South of Rome, in particular in Naples, Calabria and Sicily, everyone was poorer, the government was corrupt, Barely anything worked, crime was high, and it almost seemed like the South would never improve no matter what the wealthy cities of the North did. While doing an autopsy on a Calabrian robber, Dr. Lambroso noticed 2 dimples in his skull and had an idea. Maybe Southern Italians are just biologically inferior, a separate race, less civilized than Northern Italians. From there, a historicist theory of race formed and proclaimed that through once having been conquered by Moorish kingdoms, Southern Italians may have mixed with what he saw as inferior African races and were therefore more prone to violence, uncivilized and ungovernable. Lambroso's ideas caught on and were part of a larger trend of pseudoscientific racism at that time. To this day, the racist notion of people being racially inferior persists in many parts of the world. Back in the days of Lambroso, this idea started to convince a lot of Northern Italians that Southern Italy simply won't improve, because you cannot improve on a supposed racial inferiority of Southern Italians. The South was therefore largely left to itself and consequently wallowed further into poverty and despair. Ironically, through this, the poverty of Southern Italy became more of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Southern Italy didn't improve because nobody tried to improve it. By the 1880s, Southern Italians had enough and began one of the largest migrations in human history. Up to 20 million to 30 million of them left Southern Italy for the United States, Brazil and Argentina. Something that politicians in Northern Italy at the time welcomed and encouraged as a means to rid the country of an inferior race. However, ironically, that mass immigration of Southern Italians into the United States is what ultimately proved Lambroso wrong. From star athletes, to musicians, to successful businessmen, and to scientists and Nobel laureates, social media stars, to movie directors and actors, to a Supreme Court justice, Southern Italians proved that they were more than capable to be law-abiding and successful citizens within a social framework that gave them the ability to freely work, prosper, and succeed. Today, the average Italian American, who is by and large a descendant of Southern Italian immigrants, is better educated and has a higher average income than your average Northern Italian. The cruelest irony about Lambroso's racist nonsense is that he was Jewish, and 10 years after his death, his racist nonsense became the law in Mussolini's Italy, where his own children, who had broken with him over his racist nonsense, suffered the consequences of his nonsense by becoming victims of the Holocaust. The historical value of theories of race are also questionable to say the least. Take the entire basis of the previous claim, the idea that Southern Italians are racially inferior because they were conquered by North Africans. What is it exactly that supposedly makes North Africans less civilized? North African kingdoms of the early Middle Ages tended to be urban functioning state structures at a time when most of Europe remained under a feudal structure. The last conquerors of Southern Italy were also not North Africans, but the Normans. The Normans are in fact often cited in racial theories of history as a supposedly superior people, yet close examination of Southern Italy reveals that Norman feudalism, when examined, ultimately is the foundational cause of Southern Italian poverty. The ideas Lambroso formulated, unfortunately, still fall on fertile ground in some places to this very day. The notion that some people are just racially inferior is a highly susceptible one to some, but it never withstands closer inspection and scrutiny. Besides Italy, elsewhere in the world you will find similar revelations that disprove the theory of race. Argentina is one of the most ethnically European countries in the world. The Native Americans of Argentina were almost completely wiped out by disease and genocide. It is estimated that up to 30% of Argentines have native ancestry, but that usually lies several generations back. Barely 1.5% of Argentina's population is Native American, and only 2% are mixed-race Native European mestizos. Argentina used to be a frontier country in the Spanish Empire. Its population consequently consisted mainly of European settlers who settled there with the intention to escape the authority, laws and taxes of the Spanish crown. The African slave population was comparatively low, and before the abolition of slavery, the Argentinian government allowed Argentine slave owners to sell their slaves to neighboring Brazilian slave plantations, which many did. Since racial intermarriage was not illegal, and because of the enormous influx of European immigrants in the 19th century, the remaining Afro-Argentine population diluted through intermarriage and almost completely vanished into the wider European population. Only 0.3% of Argentina's population is black, only 7% claim black ancestry, We all know the memes mocking Argentinians over claims of being white, but there's a truth to the claim, but also to the joke. Some Argentines may get a sense of misplaced pride and bigotry out of their heritage, such as when its president recently proclaimed that Argentinians came from European ships, while Mexicans are Indians and Brazilians came from African jungles. But all that demographic data that some Argentines may draw pride from didn't protect Argentines from Argentinian politics, meaning the disastrous decisions, policies and consequences of Peronism and a fascist junta. Argentina serves as a great example of how being of a specific ethnicity or race is by no means any kind of guarantee of success, wealth, or socio-political stability. But what about the claim of racial inferiority? In the Caribbean, you will find the poorest and most dysfunctional state in all of the Americas, Haiti. And there's a claim made by some that Haiti finds itself in this position because its population is over 90% black. Similar claims have been made about various impoverished Caribbean states like Jamaica, and these claims have had some horrendous consequences for the region, such as the murder of Afro-Latinos and Haitians in massacres by Dominican military juntas who wanted to keep their country white. The absurdity of the claim becomes obvious as soon as you look at the three richest states of the Caribbean: the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, and St. Kitts and Nevis. Something advocates of racial theories of development don't like to do, because all of them are also over 90% black in population. But it is far more than just that. Not only are these countries majority Afro-Caribbean in demographics, no, they had to build their prosperity by themselves. When slavery was abolished, many of these places became impoverished and were also increasingly ignored by colonial overlords who sought richer bounties by colonizing Asia and Africa. The cultural norms, their social contracts, the economic structures and institutions of governments are things that Afro-Caribbeans have by and large built by themselves, through themselves. With the example of Jamaica, we can also see how the race hypothesis is increasingly disproven by the passage of time. Jamaica may have been poor during the 1990s, but has in recent decades made increasing headways in becoming one of the fastest growing economies of the Caribbean with ever rising living standards. Jamaica these days is more evidence that black people are not doomed by the color of their skin. There's no genetic or any kind of biological trait that makes Africans, black people, people of African descent, people of color, or whatever your region's preferred terminology is, in any way destined to failure in constructing functioning societies. The stereotype of the poor African increasingly falls apart with the increasingly emerging success stories of several African states. This matters because the existence of even just one single prospering and functioning majority African society disproves the notion of African racial inferiority in its entirety, period. North Korea is not in such a bad state because it is racially inferior to South Korea. As mentioned before, the Korean Peninsula is the petri dish of the largest nurture versus nature experiment in human history, and the results are very conclusive. North Koreans are not racially inferior. They're just communists, and therefore politically, economically, and institutionally inferior. Institutions matter. They determine outcomes in development. The color of your skin does not. Thank you for watching this video. You can support this channel through becoming a member, a patron, or by a PayPal donation, or by just sharing the video around. If you want to discuss this video with other viewers, then don't forget to join our community on Discord. A link is in the description. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon again with another video.